The landing struts of the freighter Iron Mule groaned in protest as the ship settled onto the polished obsidian of the landing pad. Inside the cockpit, Jim exhaled the breath he felt he had been holding since they entered the upper atmosphere of Astriel. The flight console was a Christmas tree of amber warning lights, but the engine temperature was holding steady, which was all that mattered. Jim flicked a toggle switch, killing the main thrusters. The hum of the sublight drives died down, replaced by the distinct hiss of cooling hydraulics. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, feeling the grit of 3 days of travel. He was not a diplomat. He was not a royal courier. He was a man with a mortgage on a ship that was older than his father, and he had 3 children, war orphans he had collected along the way. In the cargo hold, who were currently arguing over the last packet of freeze-dried strawberries. He spun his chair around. The bulkhead door hissed open, and Alvin, his eldest, stepped through. At 15, the boy was trying hard to be the co-pilot. Jim never asked for his face smudged with grease from trying to fix the hydration recycler. "We are down," Alvin said, trying to sound professional, though his voice cracked slightly on the last word. "Landing clamp secure, but the portside stabilizer is reading 40% efficiency. We need parts, Dad." "We need money for parts, Al," Jim corrected gently, unbuckling his harness. "Which is why we are here. A simple drop-off. Medical supplies and rare isotopes for the Citadel's energy grid. We unload, we get paid, we leave before the political radiation burns us." Behind Alvin, Clara popped her head in. She was 12, going on 30, with eyes that missed nothing and a mouth that spared no one. "It is a palace, Dad," she said, looking out the viewport at the towering spires of the astral citadel, which pierced the violet clouds like crystalline needles. "Rich people do not pay on time. They pay in exposure or gratitude. We are going to starve." "We are not going to starve," Jim said, standing up and stretching his stiff back. "And keep an eye on Martha. The sensors on this planet are sensitive. I do not want her wandering off." "Martha is talking to the wall again," Clara noted, pointing a thumb backward. "She says the landing pad is humming in B-flat." Jim paused. Martha, his youngest at 8, had always been different. Sensitive to things that scanners missed. If she said the pad was humming, it was humming. He grabbed his flight jacket, a worn leather piece with patches from a war he tried hard to forget, and zipped it up. "Right," Jim said. "Everyone helmets off but respirators ready just in case. The atmosphere is breathable, but the pollen count is lethal if you have allergies. Let's get the cargo bay open. The sooner we are off this rock, the better." They moved to the cargo bay. The Iron Mule was not designed for luxury. It was a utilitarian box of rivets and steel. In the center of the bay sat 4 massive crates, magnetically locked to the deck. Inside were isotopes worth more than the ship itself. Jim walked to the control panel by the rear ramp. He punched in the code 1138 and hit the green release button. "Okay," Jim muttered to himself. "Hangar door opening. Best behavior, kids. If you see someone with a crown, do not stare. If you see someone with a gun, hide behind me." The hydraulic seals hissed. The heavy ramp began to lower, revealing a slice of the outside world. Usually, when a hangar door opens at a royal citadel, one expects a rigid line of honor guards, perhaps a protocol droid with a shiny chassis, or a bored customs official. Jim expected order. What he got was a catastrophe of bioluminescence and fur. The moment the ramp dropped the final foot, a sound hit them, a high-pitched vibrating shriek that felt less like a noise and more like a drill pressing against a molar. "What is that?" Alvin shouted over the din covering his ears. Before Jim could answer, the gap between the ramp and the ground was filled. Not by soldiers, but by creatures. Small, four-legged, and moving with a fluidity that defied physics. They poured into the cargo bay like water rushing through a broken dam. There were 9 of them. They were the size of bobcats, but their fur shimmered with shifting patterns of electric blue and violent violet. Their eyes were too large, glowing with an internal light, and they did not just run, they ricocheted. One launched itself off the hydraulic piston, bounced off the ceiling of the cargo bay, and landed on top of the isotope crate. Another scurried up the wall, defying gravity entirely, its claws digging into the steel plating as if it were soft wood. "Intruders!" Alvin yelled, grabbing a wrench. "No!" Jim barked, his pilot eyes tracking the movement. "Not intruders. Look at the collars. Look at the tech." Each of the creatures wore a collar of intricate gold and platinum filigree, pulsing with a faint shielding field. These were not pests. They were pets. Or worse. "They are glowing!" Martha squealed, not in fear, but in delight. She reached out a hand, but Clara yanked her back. "Do not touch the radioactive space cats, Martha!" Clara shouted. The chaos escalated in a heartbeat. The creature on the isotope crate hissed, its back arching. As it did, the air in the cargo bay warped. The gravity plating beneath their feet groaned. "Dad!" Alvin floated upward, his boots leaving the deck. Jim grabbed a handrail. The local gravity field was fluctuating wildly. These creatures were not just biological. They were interacting with the ship's artificial gravity mesh. "Hold on to something!" Jim roared. The crate, the one weighing 500 kilograms, lifted off the deck as the magnetic locks failed under the distortion. It hovered, rotating slowly, drifting dangerously toward where Martha and Clara were huddled near the bulkhead. Outside, on the pristine landing pad, sirens began to wail. Red lights swept across the open ramp. A squad of security drones, sleek and silver, zoomed into view, their weapon ports charging. "Unidentified vessel," a mechanical voice boomed from the drones. "You are in violation of royal containment protocols. Power down your singularity drive immediately." "My drive is off!" Jim shouted back, though the drones could not hear him. "It is your cats. They are wrecking my ship." The crate groaned, tilting. It was going to fall, directly onto his daughters. Time seemed to slow down. It was the same sensation Jim used to get in the cockpit of a fighter jet, right before a missile locked the world, narrowing down to a single vector of geometry and consequence. He could not reach them in time. The gravity was too unstable for him to run. "Alvin, the maintenance drone," Jim ordered, his voice cutting through the panic. "Manual override." Alvin, floating near the ceiling, kicked off the wall and grabbed the remote control for the heavy lifter drone strapped to the bay wall. He fumbled with the controller. "I cannot stabilize it," Alvin screamed. "The interference is too strong." Jim saw the creature on the crate hiss again. The gravity hold broke. The 500-kilogram box plummeted. Jim did not think. He let go of the handrail. He kicked off the floor, launching himself not at the girls, but at the drone controller in Alvin's hand. He snatched it midair, twisted his body, and thumbed the thrusters to maximum. The heavy lifter drone shot off the wall like a bullet. Jim didn't try to lift the crate. There was no time. Instead, he rammed the drone into the side of the falling crate. Clang. The impact was metal on metal, violent and loud. But it was enough. The crate was knocked sideways, skidding across the deck plates and crashing into the far wall, missing Clara and Martha by less than 2 feet. The ship shuddered. Jim hit the floor hard, rolling to absorb the impact. He came up in a crouch, adrenaline flooding his system. The security drones were advancing up the ramp, now weapons raised. The 9 creatures were still screaming a discordant chorus that made Jim's vision blur. One of the creatures, a sleek one, with fur the color of a bruised plum, landed in front of Jim. It bared its teeth, its body vibrating with that chaotic energy. The air around it rippled. Jim looked at the creature. He saw the dilated pupils, the flattened ears, the erratic twitching of the tail. He recognized it. Not the species, but the state. It was panic. Pure, blind sensory overload panic. He had seen it in rookie pilots on their first drop. He had seen it in his own children during the bombardments on the outer colonies. Jim closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. He exhaled, forcing his heart rate to drop. It was an old trick from the academy, the void state. He opened his eyes and looked directly at the creature. He did not yell. He did not back away. Instead, he began to hum. It was a low, guttural sound originating from the diaphragm resonating in the chest cavity. It was not a song. It was a frequency, a specific oscillating vibration he used to calibrate the harmonic sensors on older engines. But he had learned years ago that it had a strange effect on biological nervous systems. He paired it with a rhythmic breathing pattern. Inhale for 4 counts, hold for 4, exhale for 4. The sound cut under the high-pitched shrieking of the creatures. It was a counter-frequency, a grounding wire for the static in the air. The plum-colored creature froze, its head tilted. Jim kept humming, deepening the tone, projecting it forward. He extended a hand palm up, fingers relaxed. One by one, the other creatures stopped moving. The one swinging from the hydraulic line dropped down softly. The one chewing on the landing gear released its grip. The gravity fluctuations in the bay smoothed out. The floating tools clattered to the floor. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the smell of ozone and burnt insulation. The security drones hovered at the edge of the ramp, their targeting lasers confusingly dancing over the scene, unsure of what to shoot. The plum-colored creature crept forward. It sniffed Jim's gloved hand. Then, with a sound that was half purr and half engine idle, it rubbed its cheek against his knuckles. Its eyes, previously wide with terror, drooped to half-mast. Jim stopped humming, but he kept his breathing rhythmic. "Clear the ramp," a voice commanded. The voice was not loud, but it carried an authority that made the security drones part instantly. Jim looked up. Standing at the base of the ramp was a woman. She was tall, draped in robes of iridescent silk that seemed to shift color with her movement. Her hair was silver, pulled back into a severe, intricate braid that defied gravity. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were vertical slits of molten gold. She was humanoid, but the feline ancestry was undeniable in the high sweep of her cheekbones, the slight point of her ears, and the way she stood poised, balanced ready to strike or vanish. It was Queen Irene, ruler of the astral system. Jim stood up slowly, keeping his movements fluid so as not to startle the creature at his feet. He wiped a smear of grease from his cheek, suddenly conscious of his worn flight jacket and the fact that his ship looked like a garbage can compared to her palace. Behind the Queen, a man in a pristine uniform, Keon Vale the royal steward, was frantically tapping on a datapad, looking as if he was trying to calculate the insurance cost of the last 30 seconds. Beside him hovered a Nannybot, a spherical unit with a dented chassis and one eye that flickered intermittently. The Queen walked up the ramp. Her heels clicked on the metal with a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. She stopped 3 feet from Jim. She looked at the crate smashed against the wall. She looked at Alvin, who was still holding the drone controller. She looked at Clara and Martha huddled together. Finally, she looked at the creature rubbing against Jim's leg. "They stopped," she said. Her voice was cool, detached like wind over ice. "Why did they stop?" "They were scared, Your Majesty," Jim said, his voice raspy from the humming. "Panic creates feedback loops. I just broke the loop." Irene's golden eyes narrowed slightly. For a second, the mask of the Queen slipped. Jim saw it, the tightening at the corners of her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands, which she hid by clasping them together. It was the look of a parent who had not slept in 3 days, and was one spilled cup of juice away from a breakdown. "Scared," she repeated the word, tasting bitter in her mouth. "They are the heirs to the astral throne. They are not supposed to know fear. They are supposed to be apex predators." "They are kids," Jim said, shrugging. "Apex or not, loud noises and strange ships are scary." The Nannybot Brio floated forward its speaker, crackling with static. Scan complete. Subject male. Species human. Occupation, unemployed error correction pilot. Status alive. Conclusion, welcome new nanny candidate. Jim blinked. Excuse me, I am a pilot. I am here to deliver isotopes. Brio's single eye spun wildly. Pilot nanny logic circuits indicate 90% overlap in required skill set. Both handle screaming. Both handle vomiting. Both require evasive maneuvers. Welcome, nanny. I am not a nanny, Jim insisted, looking at Keon Vale. Look, I just want my payment. 2,000 credits as agreed. Then I will take my kids and go. You can keep the space cats. Cubs, Irene corrected sharply. They are the royal cubs. Before Jim could argue, the air in the hangar grew colder. The sound of heavy boots approached. Your Majesty, a voice oiled with false concern drifted up the ramp. I was informed of a security breach. A containment failure. Again. Chancellor Audrin Malk stepped into the cargo bay. He was a man who looked like he had been carved out of gray marble and polished with vinegar. He wore the high-collared black uniform of the High Council, and his eyes were dark, devoid of warmth. He looked at Jim, the way one looks at a stain on an expensive carpet. Malk surveyed the scene, the toppled crate, the grease, the human children. His lip curled in distaste. This is unacceptable, Malk stated. These creatures, these heirs, are out of control. They have damaged a civilian vessel. They have breached the perimeter. The Council will hear of this. It was an accident, Chancellor, Irene said, her voice regaining its steel. They are sensitive to the atmospheric pressure changes. They are feral, Malk countered, stepping closer to the Queen. He towered over her, using his physical presence as a weapon. We have tried 25 nannies in the last month, Irene. 25. Robots, xenobiologists, behavioral therapists. The cubs broke them all. And now look at them. Malk pointed a gloved finger at the plum-colored cub by Jim's leg. The cub hissed at Malk, its fur sparking. There is no discipline, Malk said. There is no order. The ninefold eclipse is approaching. In less than 30 days, the resonance will begin. If they cannot control their own biofields by then, they will tear the Citadel apart during the succession ceremony. Jim listened, keeping his face neutral. He knew about the eclipse, everyone in the sector did. It was a rare celestial event where the 9 moons of Astriel aligned. He didn't know much about the resonance, but judging by the tension in the room, it was bad news. Malk reached into his pocket and pulled out a slim silver device. It looked like a collar, but thicker, with pulsing red nodes on the inside. The Council has authorized the use of the neural dampeners, Malk said softly. It is a simple procedure. We attach these. They regulate the emotional centers of the brain. No more panic. No more gravity distortions. Perfect obedience. It is the only way to ensure they are ready for the eclipse. Irene stiffened. You want to lobotomize my children, Audrin? I want to save the Empire, Malk said. If they fail the resonance, the throne is empty. And we cannot have an empty throne. Sign the order, Irene. Let me install the dampeners. The silence returned, but this time it was dangerous. Jim saw Irene's hand twitch toward the weapon at her belt, then stop. She was cornered. If she said no, she looked weak and irresponsible. If she said yes, she destroyed her children. Jim looked down at the cub. It was looking up at him, its large eyes reflecting the hangar lights. It was trembling slightly. Jim thought of Alvin Clara and Martha. He thought of the nights he spent holding Martha when the nightmares of the war woke her up. He thought of the way the military used to talk about soldiers as assets, to be calibrated, not people. He hated bullies. And Malk was a bully in a fancy suit. They are not broken, Jim said. Malk turned his head slowly, as if surprised the furniture was speaking. Excuse me. The cubs, Jim said, meeting Malk's gaze. They are not broken. They are just overstimulated. You put a neural dampener on a bioactive species like this, you will not get obedience. You will get a pressure cooker, bottling up energy that strong. It will blow the moment the eclipse hits. Malk's eyes narrowed. And you are a xenobiologist, a royal tutor. I am a father, Jim said. And I have flown ships with engines more temperamental than your politics. You do not fix a turbulence issue by welding the flaps shut. You learn to fly through it. Malk scoffed a dry rattling sound. How quaint. A mechanic offering parenting advice to the High Council. He calmed them, Irene said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through Malk's dismissal. She turned to Jim. You calmed them. In seconds. How? It is a technique, Jim said vaguely. Resonance matching. Irene looked at him for a long moment. She seemed to be weighing something heavy. She looked at Malk, then at the cubs, then back at Jim. Chancellor, Irene said, lifting her chin. You said we need a solution before the eclipse. You said the current nannies are failing. I did, Malk said. Then I have found a new candidate, Irene said. She pointed at Jim. Him. Jim's jaw dropped. Wait, what? He calmed them when no one else could, Irene continued, her voice gaining strength. He has practical experience. He is hired. This is absurd, Malk spat. He is a human, a scavenger. He has no clearance, no pedigree. And he is the only one standing here with a cub rubbing against his leg instead of trying to eat his face, Irene countered. She turned to Keon Vale. Steward, draw up a contract. Temporary custodianship. Duration until the end of the ninefold eclipse. Now, hold on a minute. Jim stepped forward, raising his hands. I did not agree to this. I have a schedule. I have a delivery route. I cannot babysit 9 royal alien cats for a month. The hangar is locked down, Malk said, cold, checking his datapad. Security Protocol 7 Alpha. Due to the biological containment breach caused by your vessel, your ship is impounded pending a full decontamination scan. That takes approximately 40 days. Jim froze. He looked at Malk. The Chancellor was smiling a thin, cruel smile. He had locked the hangar. He was trapping them here. If Jim refused the job, he would rot in a holding cell while his ship was dismantled. If he took the job, he was stuck in the middle of a power struggle. 40 days, Jim repeated. Unless, of course, you are royal staff, Irene said, offering him a lifeline. Royal staff have priority clearance. Their ships are expedited. Jim looked at his kids. Alvin looked pale. Clara looked furious. Martha was waving at the plum-colored cub. He looked at Irene. Her eyes were pleading a desperate signal, hidden behind the royal command. Help me, Jim sighed. A long, deep sigh that deflated his shoulders. The pay, Jim said. It had better be astronomical. Triple the standard rate, Irene said quickly. Plus room and board for your brood. And full repairs for my ship, Jim added. Done, Irene said. Dad, Alvin whispered. Are we seriously doing this? Jim looked at his son. We do not have a choice, Al. We are grounded. He turned back to the Queen and the Chancellor. He straightened his jacket. All right, Jim said. I will watch your cubs. But we do things my way. No collars, no dampeners. And if anyone tries to lobotomize these kids while I am on shift, there will be a diplomatic incident involving my wrench and their face. Malk's expression darkened. We shall see, human. The eclipse reveals all flaws. Do not think you can hide yours. Malk turned on his heel and marched out of the hangar, his boots echoing ominously. Irene exhaled her shoulders, slumping slightly, now that the enemy was gone. She looked at Jim, and for the first time, there was no command in her voice, only relief. Thank you, she said softly. Do not thank me yet, Jim muttered, looking down at the 9 glowing cubs who were now beginning to sniff his boots, his tires, and his children. I have no idea what I am doing. Brio, the nanny bot, floated up to Jim's face. Correction. You are now senior caretaker. Advice. Do not let them eat after midnight, or before midnight. Actually, just run. Jim watched as the hangar doors behind them sealed shut with a finality that echoed in his chest. He looked at the massive citadel rising above them, a labyrinth of light and shadow. This was supposed to be a milk run, a quick stop. Now he was the only thing standing between 9 radioactive kittens and a galactic political coup. Okay, Jim clapped his hands, startling the cubs. First rule of the new management. Nobody eats the cargo. Let's go. As they began to move toward the palace elevators, Jim felt a strange vibration in his chest. It wasn't the humming. It was a feeling he hadn't had in a long time. He was walking into a storm, and for the first time in years, he wasn't flying away from it. The doors to the royal nursery did not slide open. They dissolved. One moment there was a wall of polished obsidian, and the next the molecules simply parted like mist, revealing the sanctuary within. Jim stepped through, expecting a playroom. He expected soft mats, maybe some brightly colored toys, perhaps a few scratching posts plated in gold. What he walked into was a hallucination. The room was vast, a domed chamber, large enough to house his entire ship. But the walls were not walls. They were living membranes of light, pulsing with a gentle rhythmic bioluminescence. And swimming through the air, literally swimming through the nitrogen-oxygen mix, were schools of holographic fish. They were translucent, shimmering with data streams darting around invisible coral reefs, projected onto the furniture. "Watch your step," a voice called out. "The floor is currently simulating a mossy riverbank. It can be slippery if you are wearing standard-issue flight boots." Jim looked down. The floor was indeed rippling, reacting to the pressure of his soles. He looked up to see a woman in a white lab coat approaching. She had the tired eyes of a medic in a field hospital, and hair that looked like it had been styled by a static shock. "Dr. Sarah Wren," she introduced herself, extending a hand that was stained with blue ink. "Neuroxenobiologist, and currently the only person in this palace who hasn't tried to jump out of an airlock in frustration." "Jim," he replied, shaking her hand. "Pilot. And this is my ground crew." He gestured to Alvin, Clara, and Martha. Alvin was trying to look unimpressed. His arms crossed, though his eyes were darting around the room, analyzing the holographic projectors. Clara was already poking a floating fish which dissolved into binary code before reforming. Martha, however, stood perfectly still near the entrance, her head tilted to the side. "It is loud here," Martha whispered. "It is silent, Martha," Alvin corrected her gently. "It is soundproofing technology." "No," Dr. Wren interjected, looking at the little girl with sudden interest. "She is right. It is loud. Just not in the audio spectrum. You are hearing the resonance." Dr. Wren turned to Jim. "That is the first thing you need to understand, Jim. This isn't just a room. The nursery is built on top of the Citadel's bioquantum core. It is linked directly to the cubs' nervous systems." She pointed to the ceiling, where the light was shifting from a calm blue to an agitated orange. "When they are happy, the room sings. When they are angry, the gravity fluctuates. And when they are scared," Dr. Wren paused, looking at a scorch mark on the far wall. "Well, let us just say you do not want to be standing near heavy furniture." At that moment, the Queen entered. Irene glided into the room, followed by the ever-anxious steward Keon Vale. She had changed from her ceremonial robes into something simpler, a fitted tunic of dark gray, but the air of command remained. Yet Jim noticed the details that the holograms couldn't hide. The way her fingernails were digging into the palms of her hands. The way her breath hitched in her chest, caught behind a ribcage that seemed too tight for her heart. She was a statue made of ice, cracking under the heat of a sun she couldn't control. "Where are they?" Irene asked, her voice tight. "Hiding," Dr. Wren sighed. "We had an incident with the breakfast delivery drone. Number 4 didn't like the temperature of the synthetic milk. The room responded by turning the floor into lava for 6 seconds. Lava, Jim asked. Holographic lava, Dr. Wren clarified. But the heat feedback was real enough to singe the drone's eyebrows. If it had eyebrows. They are monsters, Keon Vale muttered under his breath, adjusting his collar. They are children, Jim said, stepping forward. Where are they hiding? Up, Clara said, pointing. Jim looked up. Clinging to the chandelier 50 feet above the ground were 9 pairs of glowing eyes. They were huddled together in a ball of fur and light, vibrating with a frequency that made Jim's teeth ache. Get them down, Irene ordered, though there was no force in it. It was a plea disguised as a command. Please, Jim walked to the center of the room. The holographic fish parted around him. He looked up at the chandelier. The cubs hissed a sound like steam, escaping a high-pressure valve. All right, Jim said to himself. Phase 1. Establish a perimeter. He turned to Alvin. Al, I need you to set up a base camp. Get with Mr. Vale. We need sleeping quarters adjacent to this room. Not down the hall, right here. If the gravity goes sideways at 3 in the morning, I want to be able to roll out of bed and catch them. Alvin nodded, turning to the steward. You heard the captain. We need 4 cots, and a private bathroom, and access to the kitchen. My sister gets low blood sugar. Keon Vale looked affronted. This is the royal nursery. We do not put cots in the... Do you want to clean up the next lava spill? Alvin cut him off, channeling an authority that he had definitely learned from Jim. Because my dad charges extra for hazardous waste removal. Keon sputtered, then pulled out his data pad, marching off with Alvin trailing him, the boy already negotiating for higher thread count sheets. Jim turned to Clara. She was currently standing in front of Brio, the battered nanny bot. This thing has a terrible voice synthesizer, Clara critiqued, popping open the bot's maintenance panel. It sounds like a dying toaster. Do not break the royal property, Clara, Jim warned. I am improving it, she retorted. Her fingers flew over the bot's exposed circuitry. There, try now. Brio floated up, its eyes spinning. System reboot, it announced. But instead of the mechanical monotone, the voice that came out was a soft, rhythmic purr, followed by a very distinct, very realistic meow. Jim pressed his lips together to keep from laughing. Irene blinked, startled. Did that robot just meow at me? The Queen asked. It is a dialect, Clara said innocently, wiping grease on her pants. Cat-to-human translation. Trust me, it is better for the cubs. The old voice was stressing them out. Jim shook his head and looked back up at the chandelier. The distraction had worked. The cubs were peering down, curious about the new sounds. Okay, Jim said. Showtime. He sat down, right in the middle of the floor. He crossed his legs, resting his hands on his knees, palms open. It was a posture of total vulnerability. In a place where everyone stood stiff with protocol, sitting on the floor was an act of rebellion. What are you doing? Irene asked, stepping closer. Stand up. You are the caretaker. You must assert dominance. Dominance is for dogs, Your Majesty, Jim said, without looking at her. Cats require curiosity. And right now, I am the most boring thing in the room. I need to become interesting. He closed his eyes. He began the breathing. Inhale. 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. Exhale. 2, 3, 4. He didn't just breathe. He broadcast it. He let his chest expand visibly. He added the hum, that low, resonant vibration that sat somewhere between a cello string and a starship engine idling. The room reacted. The holographic fish slowed down. The pulsing light on the walls synced with his rhythm. Doctor, Jim said softly between hums. What is the current bio reading? Heart rates are dropping, Dr. Wren whispered, looking at her tablet. From 200 beats per minute to 180. They are watching you. Jim kept humming. Then he raised his right hand. He didn't point. He just held up one finger. Then 2. then 3. He closed his hand and started again. 1, 2, 3. It was a pilot's game, a focus drill for long-haul flights when the autopilot was broken and you had to manually pulse the thrusters. Rhythm, pattern, predictability. Above him, a shadow detached from the chandelier. One of the cubs floated down. It didn't use its anti-gravity jumps. It simply drifted, controlling its descent with its own biofield. It was the smallest one, a creature with fur the color of storm clouds. It landed 5 feet from Jim. It hissed, its ears flattened. Jim didn't flinch. He didn't stop humming. He just kept counting his fingers. 1, 2, 3. The cub watched his hand. Its head tilted. Its tail, which had been lashing violently, slowed down. Swish, swish, stop. The cub took a step forward, then another. It reached out a paw and batted at Jim's moving finger. Jim let it. He let the sharp little claw snag the tough leather of his glove. He didn't pull away. "That is it," Jim murmured, his voice woven into the hum. "I am not a threat. I am just a rhythm." Another cub dropped down, then 2 more. Within 2 minutes, all 9 were on the floor. They weren't sitting still. They were prowling, sniffing his boots, chewing on his shoelaces, but they weren't screaming. They weren't breaking reality. One of them, the plum-colored one from the hangar, walked right up to Jim's chest. It sniffed his flight jacket, smelling the old engine oil and the faint scent of coffee. It sneezed. Then, remarkably, it pressed its forehead against Jim's arm and let out a long, rattling breath. Jim felt the tension leave the small body. And as the cub relaxed, the room changed. The frenetic orange light on the ceiling faded into a soft twilight purple. The floor stopped rippling. Jim looked up. Irene was staring at him. Her mouth was slightly open, her mask of royalty completely gone. She looked stunned. "They never touch anyone," Irene whispered. "Not even me. Their fields, they repel contact when they are stressed." "They are starved for contact," Jim said, quietly, stroking the cub's ears. "They are just afraid that if they touch something, they will break it. Or it will break them." He looked at Irene, really looked at her. "They need to know you are durable, Irene, that you can take the voltage." Irene flinched at the use of her name without the title, but she didn't correct him. She took a step forward, her hand reaching out, trembling. Before she could touch the cub, a harsh buzz cut through the air. Jim looked toward the corner of the room. A small black sphere was hovering there, its red lens focused on them. "What is that?" Jim asked, his voice hardening. Keon Vale, who had returned with Alvin, looked pale. "That is a monitor drone. From the Chancellor's office. Standard procedure for compliance observation." Jim saw the red light blink. It wasn't just watching. It was recording. And judging by the angle, it was framing the shot to make it look like Jim was being attacked or that the cubs were swarming him. He is building a case, Jim realized. He is waiting for a screw-up. "He wants the collars," Irene said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Every time they break something, every time they panic, it goes into his file. Evidence of uncontrollable nature." As if on cue, the storm cloud cub noticed the drone. It didn't like the red eye. It hissed, its back arching. Crack. The air pressure in the room dropped instantly. A vase on a pedestal near the door shattered, though no one had touched it. The shards didn't fall. They floated, spinning in the air like deadly confetti. The other cubs reacted to the sudden noise. Panic rippled through them like a chain reaction. The holographic fish turned into jagged spikes of red light. "Easy," Jim barked, but not at the cubs. He looked at the drone. "Clara, kill that bug." Clara didn't ask questions. She pulled a small magnetic emitter from her belt, something she used to unlock cargo crates, and chucked it at the drone. It hit the drone with a solid thunk. The drone spiraled down its anti-grav drive, disrupted, and crashed onto the mossy floor simulation. The red light died, but the damage was done. The cubs were agitated again. The floating shards of the vase were swirling faster, creating a dangerous vortex near the entrance. Jim grabbed the plum-colored cub, holding it tight against his chest to stop it from launching itself into the glass tornado. "Dr. Wren!" Jim shouted. "The lights dim them to 20% blue spectrum only." Dr. Wren scrambled to a console. "Adjusting! Irene!" Jim yelled. The Queen looked at him wide-eyed, paralyzed by the sudden chaos. "Do not just stand there," Jim roared. "Talk to them. They are reacting to your fear. You are the anchor point." "I do not know what to say," Irene stammered. "Say anything," Jim shouted, ducking as a shard of glass embedded itself in the wall inches from his head. "Just do not lie to them." Irene took a breath. She looked at the 9 terrified creatures, her children who were currently defying gravity because they didn't know how to handle their own power. "I am here," Irene shouted. Her voice was not the royal voice. It was higher, shakier, but real. "I am here, and I am not leaving. It is just a broken vase. It is just noise." She stepped into the swirl of glass. She didn't flinch. She walked straight toward the vortex. The cubs stopped hissing. They looked at her. "I am not afraid," Irene said, though her hands were shaking. "I am not afraid of you." The vortex slowed. The glass shards fell to the floor with a harmless tinkle. The room stabilized. Jim exhaled, checking the cub in his arms. It was trembling, but it wasn't biting. He looked at Irene. She was standing amidst the broken glass, breathing hard. She looked terrifying and beautiful. "Well," Jim said, standing up and brushing glass dust from his knees. "That was a solid B-. Next time try to say it before the furniture explodes." Irene glared at him, but the corner of her mouth twitched. "You shouted at a queen." "I shouted at a mom," Jim corrected. "There is a difference." Later that evening, the nursery was quiet. The cubs were asleep, or at least recharging, piled together in a heap of glowing fur on a massive heated cushion. Jim stood on the balcony overlooking the Citadel Gardens. The air here smelled of strange flowers and ozone. He held a mug of synthetic coffee that tasted like burnt hazelnuts. Irene walked out to join him. She didn't announce herself, but Jim heard the rustle of her silk tunic. "They are asleep," she said, leaning against the railing. "For the first time in 3 weeks, they are asleep before midnight." "They were tired," Jim said. "Panic burns a lot of calories." "Malk will use the footage of the vase," Irene said bitterly. "He will edit out the part where I calmed them. He will just show the chaos." "Let him," Jim said. "The more he pushes, the more desperate he looks. Why is he so obsessed with the collars anyway? It cannot just be about order." "Power," Irene said, looking up at the moons. "The ninefold eclipse creates a surge of energy called the resonance. The heir who can harmonize with that energy gains control of the bio-quantum core. Not just the palace, the fleet, the terraforming engines, everything." She turned to Jim. "If they are wearing the dampener collars, they cannot harmonize. They will be cut off from the resonance." "And who controls the core, then?" Jim asked. "The person holding the remote control for the collars," Irene said. "Malk." Jim whistled low. "So it is a heist. He is stealing the kingdom right in front of everyone." "And I am letting him," Irene whispered, "because I am too soft. My mother, the previous queen, would have crushed him by now. She would have crushed the cubs too if they showed weakness." "You are not your mother," Jim said. "That is the problem," Irene replied. "I am weak. I let them run wild because I cannot bear to hurt them. And now that softness is going to get us all killed." Jim turned to face her. He set his mug down on the railing. "You think you are soft?" Jim asked. "I watched you walk into a tornado of broken glass today. That wasn't soft." "It was necessary," she said. "Soft isn't weak, Irene," Jim said, his voice rough. "Soft is absorbent. It takes the hit and keeps its shape. Hard things shatter. like that vase. You want to be strong for them, be the cushion, not the wall. Irene looked at him. The moonlight caught the silver in her hair, making her look otherworldly. Soft isn't weak, she repeated, testing the words. It is just harder to fake. Exactly, Jim said. Any dictator can fake strength. It takes a real leader to be vulnerable. For a moment, the distance between them felt very small. The air between them seemed to hum, not with the resonance, but with something more human. Then a small voice broke the spell. Dad, Jim turned. Martha was standing at the glass door of the balcony. She was wearing her oversized pajamas, looking tiny against the backdrop of the massive palace. What is it, sweetie? Jim asked, crouching down. Nightmare. No, Martha said. She walked over and took Jim's hand. Her fingers were cold. The walls, Martha said. They are breathing. It is the biomachinery, Martha, Jim said reassuringly. Dr. Wren explained it. The whole place is alive. No, Martha shook her head. She looked up at Jim with eyes that were too old for her face. Not the machine breathing. The other breathing. The one underneath. She pointed at the floor down toward the depths of the citadel. It sounds like you, Martha whispered. Jim froze. A chill that had nothing to do with the night air crawled up his spine. What do you mean it sounds like me? Jim asked. The rhythm, Martha said. The hum you do. The palace is doing it too, deep down. It is waiting for you to finish the song. Jim looked at Irene. The Queen looked confused. Does that make sense to you? Jim asked her. No, Irene said. The biocore has a standard frequency. It does not hum songs. Jim looked back at Martha. She wasn't lying. She never lied about these things. He stood up, looking down at his own hands. Why did he know that hum? He had told everyone it was a pilot's trick, a mechanic's habit. But where had he learned it? He tried to trace the memory back. Flight school. No. The war. It was just there, like a file that had always been on his hard drive, but he had never opened. He looked back into the nursery. The cubs were stirring. They had shifted in their sleep, forming a perfect circle. Their breathing was synchronized. Inhale. Hold. Exhale. It was his rhythm. Jim felt a sudden wave of dizziness. The smell of the ozone, the purple light, the curve of the walls hitting him all at once. Déjà vu, but violent. Are you all right? Irene asked, reaching out to touch his arm. I do not know, Jim admitted, pulling away slightly. I just got the strangest feeling that I have been here before. Impossible, Irene said. Humans have not been allowed in the Citadel since the war ended, 20 years ago. Right, Jim said, rubbing his temples. Impossible. But, as he looked at the sleeping cubs and then, at the dark breathing walls of the palace, the word impossible felt heavy and hollow in his mouth. He looked at the digital clock on the wall. 28 days until the eclipse. Jim had a sinking feeling that the storm wasn't just coming. It was already here, and he was standing in the eye of it, humming a tune he shouldn't know to children who looked at him with eyes that saw far too much. Go to bed, Irene, Jim said, his voice quiet. We have training at 0600. And bring earplugs. Tomorrow we teach them how to handle loud noises. Irene paused, then nodded. Good night, Jim. Good night, Your Majesty. She left. Jim stayed on the balcony listening. He closed his eyes and listened past the wind, past the city noise. And there, faint as a heartbeat under floorboards, he heard it. The palace was humming back. The grand hall of the astral citadel was less a room and more a canyon carved from white marble and arrogance. The ceiling vaulted so high that local weather patterns occasionally formed near the chandeliers, and today the atmosphere was heavy with the static electricity of impending judgment. Jim stood in the antechamber, adjusting the collar of the dress uniform Irene had insisted he wear. It was stiff, uncomfortable, and had far too many buttons. He felt like a penguin wrapped in aluminum foil. "This is a bad idea," Jim said, pulling at his cuffs. "I have said it 3 times, and I am saying it a fourth. Children are not show ponies. You do not trot them out to perform tricks for a bunch of bureaucrats." Queen Irene stood by the window, her back to him. She was staring out at the capital city, but Jim knew she wasn't seeing the spires or the flying traffic. She was seeing the end of her reign. "It is not a performance, Jim," she said, her voice tight. "It is a proof of life. The council believes the cubs are rabid animals. If I do not show them otherwise today, they will vote to strip me of guardianship by sunset. And then Malk takes them." Jim stopped fidgeting. He looked at her. The exhaustion he had seen in the hangar was deeper now, etched into the lines around her mouth. She wasn't fighting for a crown. She was fighting to keep her family from being turned into biological drones. "They are not ready," Jim said softer. "We have had 3 days of training. They can sit. They can breathe. But a crowd, 1,000 people staring at them, that is a lot of pressure for a kid." "Then we stand between them and the pressure," Irene said, turning to face him. Her eyes were hard golden flint. "You said you could hold their focus. Can you do it?" Jim sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I can hold it, as long as nobody sets off a firecracker." The door to the antechamber slid open. Alvin walked in, holding a data pad. He looked surprisingly professional, having traded his grease-stained jumpsuit for a clean tunic, though he still wore his utility belt. "The acoustics in the hall are terrible," Alvin reported, tapping the screen. "Too much echo. If the cubs start a feedback loop, it is going to bounce off the walls and amplify by 300%. I have adjusted the dampeners near the stage, but it is a Band-Aid." Jim looked at his son with a mixture of pride and concern. "Good work, Al. Keep the exit routes clear. If this goes south, we are not waiting for permission to leave." "Dad," Alvin said, lowering the pad, "we fly into asteroid storms for a living. This is just a political storm with fur. We can handle it." Jim smiled. "Since when did you get so wise?" "Since I started reading the Royal Protocol manuals to figure out how to get better food sent to our room," Alvin grinned. Clara and Martha were in the corner with the 9 cubs. The transformation in the creatures over the last 72 hours had been nothing short of miraculous. They were no longer vibrating blurs of panic. Their fur had smoothed down, glowing with a gentle, steady pulse of indigo light. They were currently engaged in a game of catch the laser pointer, with Clara moving with liquid grace rather than frantic energy. Clara walked over to Jim, looking innocent. Too innocent. "You look sharp, Dad," she said. "Very regal." "I look like a disco ball," Jim grumbled. "Here," she said, patting his chest pocket. "I fixed your comms unit. The signal was drifting. You will need it clear to talk to Alvin during the show." "Thanks, kiddo," Jim said. He looked at the time. 10 minutes. Everybody gather up." He clapped his hands. The cub's ears swiveled toward him. "All right," Jim addressed the room, his voice dropping into that calm, commanding register he used in the cockpit. "Listen up. We are going out there, we are going to walk in a line. We are going to sit on the mats, and we are going to breathe. We ignore the people in the fancy hats. We focus on the rhythm. You look at me. You listen to the hum. Got it." The room was silent. Jim took a deep breath to emphasize the point. "We are a unit," Jim said with gravitas. "We move as one. We—" Meow. The sound came from his chest. It wasn't a human meow. It was a high-pitched, synthesized kitten mewl. Jim froze. He looked down at his chest pocket. He looked at Clara. Clara was biting her lip, her shoulders shaking with suppressed laughter. Alvin coughed into his hand to hide a smile. Even Irene's stoic mask cracked a tiny smirk, tugging at the corner of her lips. "Clara," Jim said dangerously. It is a tension breaker, Clara giggled. You were getting too serious. The cubs like it. Look, Jim looked. The cubs were indeed looking at his chest pocket with intense fascination, their tails wagging slightly. The tension in the room, which had been thick enough to choke on, had popped like a bubble. We will talk later, Jim muttered, reaching into his pocket and deactivating the small sound emitter she had stuck to his comms badge. But he couldn't help but smile. All right, let's move out. The great hall was packed. It seemed every noble bureaucrat and military officer in the astral system had gathered to watch the Queen fail. The air smelled of expensive perfume and ozone. At the far end of the hall sat the High Council, a row of 12 stone chairs, occupied by individuals who looked like they had never smiled in their lives. In the center sat Chancellor Malk. He wore black robes that seemed to absorb the light around him, and his face was a portrait of polite, predatory patience. Announcing Her Majesty Queen Irene and the royal heirs, the herald boomed. The massive doors groaned open. They walked in. Irene led the way head high, looking every inch the monarch. Behind her came the cubs walking 2 by 2. They were not on leashes. They were not in cages. They were simply walking. A ripple of shock went through the crowd. Murmurs of impossible and is that a hologram drifted from the stands. Jim brought up the rear, flanked by Alvin, Clara, and Martha. He kept his eyes moving, scanning the crowd, the exits, the ventilation shafts. He wasn't a caretaker right now. He was a wingman escorting a bomber through enemy flak. They reached the raised platform in the center of the hall. The floor here was made of resonance-conductive crystal, designed to amplify the biofields of the royalty. Sit, Jim whispered. The cubs sat, 9 glowing forms arranged in a perfect semicircle around Irene. Malk leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. He picked up a microphone. Your Majesty, Malk's voice slithered through the hall speakers. You claim the heirs are stable. You claim they are ready for the eclipse. Demonstrate. Irene nodded to Jim. Jim stepped forward. He didn't look at the council. He looked at the cubs. He sat down on the crystal floor cross-legged. He closed his eyes. He began the breath. Inhale. 2, 3, 4. He started the hum. Low, deep. A vibration that traveled through the crystal floor. The cubs responded instantly. They closed their eyes. Their breathing synced with his. The indigo light of their fur deepened, becoming a steady, rhythmic pulse. The great hall fell silent. Then the magic happened. The bioquantum core of the citadel responded to the harmony. The lights in the hall dimmed, and the ceiling, the vaulted stone ceiling, began to display a projection of the night sky. Not a recording, but a live feed of the galaxy, powered by the collective resonance of the cubs. It was beautiful. The light was stable calm as the surface of a frozen lake. Martha, standing near the edge of the platform, closed her eyes and swayed slightly. They are singing, she whispered. For 5 minutes it was perfect. The council members were leaning back, their skepticism wavering. Even Malk looked momentarily unsettled, his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm on his armrest. Jim opened one eye. He caught Irene's gaze. She looked relieved. They were doing it. And then the world broke. It didn't start with a bang. It started with a shriek, not from the cubs but from the air itself. A high-pitched tearing sound like metal being ripped apart at a molecular level. Scream! A pulse of chaotic energy slammed into the platform. It was invisible, but its effects were immediate. The blue light of the cubs turned a violent, jagged crimson. The peaceful projection of the stars shattered, replaced by glitching shards of red static. Gravity failure, Alvin shouted, checking his wrist computer. The local field is inverting. The crystal floor lurched. Or rather, the gravity holding them to it vanished. Jim felt his stomach drop. He floated upward, his boots leaving the ground. The cubs panicked. The harmony was gone, replaced by 9 separate frequencies of terror. They shrieked, clawing at the air, their bodies spinning out of control. "Martha!" Jim yelled. Martha had been lifted off her feet, drifting toward the edge of the platform, which was now tilting at a 45-degree angle as the stabilizers failed. Jim kicked off a floating chair, launching himself through the air. He grabbed Martha's wrist, just as she slipped past a marble pillar. He pulled her into his chest, wrapping his arms around her. "Hold on," Jim grunted. The room was chaos. Nobles were screaming, clinging to railings as the gravity in the hall fluctuated wildly. 0 G 1 second. Double gravity the next. The resonance. Dr. Wren's voice crackled over Jim's earpiece. "Something is jamming the frequency. It is sending a feedback spike directly into their nervous systems." Jim looked at the cubs. They were writhing in pain, their light flashing like strobes. They were going to overload. If they released all that energy at once, they wouldn't just break the room. They would level the tower. "Jim!" Irene screamed, holding onto the throne to keep from falling. "Do something!" Jim grabbed a floating railing with one hand, holding Martha with the other. He closed his eyes. He tried to hum. He tried to find the counter frequency to calm them. He choked. It felt like someone had wrapped a wire around his throat. The air in the hall was vibrating with a sonic dissonance that actively canceled his voice. Every time he tried to make the sound, the pressure in his chest spiked, squeezing his lungs. It was a targeted attack. Someone knew his trick, and they had brought a jammer. "I cannot," Jim rasped, coughing. "The frequency is blocked." A large piece of the ceiling, shaken loose by the vibrations, plummeted down. It was heading straight for the plum cub, who was spinning helplessly in the air. "No!" Jim roared. He couldn't use his voice, so he used his body. He pushed off the railing, twisting in midair. He shielded Martha with his body and slammed into the plum cub, knocking it out of the path of the falling stone. Crash. The debris smashed into the crystal floor, sending a shockwave through the room. Jim hit the ground hard as the gravity suddenly snapped back on. He groaned, the wind knocked out of him. Martha was safe in his arms. The cub was shivering against his chest. But the chaos hadn't stopped. The cubs were still screaming, huddled in terrified balls. The audience was in a panic. And then calm, cool, and collected Chancellor Malk stood up. He raised a hand. The lights in the hall stabilized. The gravity normalized. It was as if he had simply decided the chaos should end. Or as if he had signaled someone to turn off the jammer. "Enough!" Malk's voice boomed, amplified by the speakers. He walked down the steps from the council tier, moving like a shark through bloody water. He stepped onto the platform, looking at the shivering cubs, the shattered floor, and the gasping queen. "We have seen enough," Malk declared, turning to the council. "The heirs are unstable. They are a danger to themselves and the Citadel. This exhibition proves it. Their emotions are too volatile to be controlled by breathing exercises." He looked at Jim, lying on the floor with dust in his hair, and sneered. "I invoke Emergency Protocol 9, Malk announced. "To protect the succession, the heirs must be secured. Immediately." He snapped his fingers. From the shadows of the hall, a squad of elite guards emerged. They weren't carrying weapons. They were carrying silver cases. The collars. "No," Irene shouted, stepping between the guards and her children. "You will not touch them." "Look around you, Irene," Malk gestured to the wreckage. "You have failed. The caretaker has failed. The eclipse is 20 days away. Do you want them to destroy the city, or do you want them to survive?" The council members were murmuring their agreement. They were scared, and scared people voted for safety. "The dampeners are the only humane option," Malk said smoothly. "They will calm the resonance. They will bring order." Irene looked at the council. She saw the fear in their eyes. She looked at Jim, who was struggling to sit up, clutching his ribs. She looked at the cubs, who were whimpering, traumatized by the feedback spike. She had no leverage. If she fought now, the guards would take them by force, and she would be arrested for endangering the public. She had to retreat. "Withdraw," Irene said, her voice shaking with suppressed rage. "Your Majesty," Keon Vale stammered. "I said withdraw," Irene shouted. "Get the cubs back to the nursery now." "Oh, wise choice," Malk said, a triumphant smile touching his lips. "But the council will require a guarantee. If you cannot stabilize them by the next new moon, the collars go on. Mandatory. Is that understood?" Irene didn't answer him. She scooped up two of the cubs and ran for the exit. Jim pulled himself up. He grabbed Martha's hand. He signaled Alvin and Clara to grab the others. "Let's go," Jim gritted out. As they fled the hall, Jim looked back. Malk was standing amidst the ruins of the rehearsal, watching them go. He didn't look like a man who had just survived a disaster. He looked like a man who had just successfully tested a weapon. The nursery was quiet, but it was the silence of a hospital ward, not a sanctuary. The holographic fish were gone, replaced by dim, static-filled emergency lighting. Jim sat on a crate, a medical drone applying a region patch to a bruise on his ribs. The physical pain was manageable. The anger was not. Keon Vale walked in, holding a scanner. He looked disheveled, his perfect hair finally out of place. "I found it," Keon said, his voice low. He held up a small, charred component. It looked like a circuit board, but it was twisted and melted. "I swept the platform after we left," Keon explained. "I found this embedded in the base of the crystal floor. It is a sonic emitter. Military grade. It was set to broadcast a dissonant frequency on the exact spectrum of the Cubs' biofield." "Malk," Jim spat. "We cannot prove it," Keon said miserably. "The serial numbers are filed off. The tech is standard black market issue. It could have been anyone. A terrorist. A radical. If we accuse the Chancellor without proof, he will sue for defamation and have us exiled." Jim slammed his fist into his palm. "He set us up. He waited until we were vulnerable, then he hit the switch." Irene was standing by the window, looking out at the dark city. She hadn't spoken since they got back. She was still wearing her royal rehearsal gown, but it was torn at the hem, stained with dust. "Leave us," Irene said. Keon hesitated. "Your Majesty." "Leave us," she repeated. Keon bowed and backed out of the room, taking Alvin, Clara, and Martha with him. The kids looked back at Jim worried, but he nodded at them to go. When the door closed, the silence stretched thin. "I am going to sign the order," Irene said. She didn't turn around. Jim blinked. "What?" "The collars," Irene said. Her voice was dead. "I am going to let him do it. Malk was right. I cannot control them. Today could have killed people. It could have killed your children, Jim." She turned around. Her face was wet with tears. She hadn't bothered to wipe away. "I am selfish," she whispered. "I have been fighting this because I didn't want them to change. I didn't want my babies to become machines. But if I don't stop this, they will die. The resonance will burn them out." "Irene, stop!" Jim stood up, wincing. "No, you stop!" Irene shouted, and suddenly the statue shattered. She wasn't a queen anymore. She was just a woman screaming at the unfairness of the universe. "You do not understand. You think this is just politics. This is my blood. Every time they hurt, I feel it. Today, when that pulse hit, I felt them dying, Jim. I felt their minds unraveling." She wrapped her arms around herself, sinking to the floor. "I am scared," she sobbed. "I am not scared of losing the throne. I do not care about the crown. I am scared of burying my children. If the collars keep them alive, then I will pay that price. I will let them hate me forever, as long as they are alive to do it." Jim watched her fall apart. He saw the raw, bleeding wound of her fear. and he knew he couldn't fix it with a pilot's wisecrack or a confident plan. He walked over and sat down on the floor next to her. He didn't touch her. He just sat there, letting his presence be a weight in the room. "I had a co-pilot," Jim said softly. "Years ago, before the kids. His name was Miller." Irene's sobbing quieted, though she didn't look up. "We were flying a medevac run out of the Orion sector," Jim continued, his eyes fixed on the opposite wall. "We took a hit. The stabilizers were shot. We were going down. I had a choice. I could try to land the bird and save the cargo 50 refugees in cryosleep, or I could eject. But the ejection system was damaged. Only one pod was working." Jim paused. The memory was a cold stone in his gut. "Miller ordered me to take it. He said he would ride the ship down, try to crash land it on water. He was the better pilot. I thought he could do it." Jim looked at his hands. "I took the pod. I watched from the window as the ship hit the atmosphere. He didn't make the water. He hit the mountain ridge. There were no survivors." Irene looked up at him, her eyes red. "I live with that every day," Jim said. "I see his face every time I look at a sunset. I hear his voice every time an engine stalls. The guilt. It never goes away, Irene. It is a shadow that walks with you." He turned to her. "But here is the thing. Miller didn't die because he was weak. He died because he was trying to save something. You want to put the collars on them, fine. They will survive. They will breathe. They will eat. But they won't be them anymore. You will be saving the vessel, but you will be killing the pilot inside." He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were cold, but she didn't pull away. "You are scared of them dying," Jim said. "I get that. I am terrified every time Alvin touches a wrench or Martha talks to a wall. But stripping away their souls to keep their bodies safe, that is not saving them. That is just making your grief easier to manage." Irene stared at him. The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. "What do I do?" she whispered. "We have 20 days. Malk has the council. He has the jammers. I cannot fight him alone." "You are not alone," Jim said. "You have me. You have my kids. And we have 9 very angry, very powerful furballs who do not like being messed with." He squeezed her hand. "Malk thinks he won today," Jim said, his voice hardening. "He thinks he broke us. But all he did was show us his hand. He needs the collars because he is scared of the resonance. He is scared of what happens if the Cubs actually connect with the eclipse." "Why?" Irene asked. "Because," Jim said, "control freaks are always terrified of things they cannot calculate. And there is nothing more unpredictable than a family that refuses to quit." The door chimed. Keon's voice came over the intercom. "Your Majesty, a message from the Council. The official ultimatum." Irene wiped her face. She stood up. She smoothed her torn dress. She pulled Jim up with her. "Read it," she commanded. "If the heirs are not fully stabilized and demonstrating controlled resonance by the morning of the eclipse." Keon read, "Guardianship will be transferred to the Chancellor, and the dampener protocols will be enacted immediately." Irene looked at Jim. The fear was still there deep in her eyes, but something else was there too. A spark. 20 days, Irene said. 19, Jim corrected. "We need a day to prep the party." "We cannot use the Great Hall," Irene said. "They will jam us again." "We do not need the hall," Jim said. "We need the source. Where is the strongest point of the resonance?" "The apex," Irene said. "The highest tower of the citadel, directly exposed to the moons." "Then that is where we go," Jim said. "We do not rehearse anymore. We train for combat. We teach them to push through the jamming. We teach them to sing louder than the static." He walked to the window and looked out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Malk was celebrating. "He wants a show," Jim murmured. "We will give him a show." He looked back at the sleeping forms of the cubs in the next room, then at his own children huddled in the doorway listening. This wasn't just a job anymore. It wasn't just a debt to be paid. He had run from his failure with Miller for 20 years. He had hidden in the dark, flying cargo, keeping his head down. But looking at Irene, and looking at those kids, Jim knew he was done running. He was going to stand his ground, even if the sky fell. The detention wing of the Astral Citadel did not smell like a prison. It smelled like a thunderstorm trapped in a bottle. The air was thick with ozone, a sharp metallic tang that coated the back of the throat and made the hair on Jim's arms stand up. There were no bars, just a shimmering, translucent energy field that hummed with a headache-inducing frequency. Inside the cell, there was a slab of white material that functioned as a bed, a hydration dispenser that dripped rhythmically, and Jim. Jim sat on the edge of the slab, his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. He had been there for 12 hours. The accusation had been swift and surgically precise. Chancellor Malk had not blamed Jim for incompetence. He had blamed him for biology. Human interference, Malk had called it before the council. The erratic biorhythms of a non-resonant species are contaminating the nursery. He is not calming them. He is infecting them with chaos. It was a lie so bold it was almost impressive. But it had worked. The council, terrified by the collapsing ceiling, and the screaming cubs, had nodded in unison. Jim looked at his hands. They were steady now, but an hour ago they had been shaking. The isolation was doing things to his head that he didn't like. It was dragging up old ghosts. In the silence of the cell, the hum of the energy field sounded like the engine of his old fighter jet right before the turbine shattered. It sounded like the hiss of the escape pod sealing shut. It sounded like Miller screaming over the comms, a sound that cut off abruptly into static. Jim squeezed his eyes shut. Breathe, he told himself. Inhale for 4. Hold for 4. But the rhythm wouldn't come. The secret skill that had tamed 9 alien predators felt useless against his own demons. He thought about Irene. That was the part that stung the most. When the guards had dragged him away, she hadn't looked at him. She had stood on the podium, her face, a mask of frozen marble staring straight ahead. She had let them take him. Logically, Jim knew why. If she had defended him, Malk would have accused her of being compromised, of putting a human pet above the safety of the Empire. She had to cut him loose to save her political neck. But logic was a cold blanket when you were sleeping on a slab of rock. "Dad!" The voice was a whisper, but in the dead silence of the wing, it sounded like a shout. Jim's head snapped up. Standing on the other side of the energy field was a small spherical robot with a dented chassis and a flickering eye. It was Brio, the nanny bot. But the voice coming out of it wasn't the bot's default setting. "Alvin," Jim scrambled off the bed. "We hacked the audio feed." Alvin's voice crackled through the bot speaker. "Clara is routing the signal through the laundry chutes. We only have 2 minutes before the security sweep cycles back." "Where are you?" Jim asked, pressing his hand against the field. It buzzed, numbing his fingertips. "Are you safe?" "We are confined to quarters," Alvin said. His voice was tight, vibrating with a rage Jim rarely heard in his son. "Malk has guards at the door. Dad, I am going to bust us out. I can rig the ventilation system to blow, create a distraction." "Negative," Jim said, his voice dropping into his commander tone. "You stand down, Alvin. Do not engage." "They locked you up like a criminal," Alvin shouted, the audio distorting. "I am not going to just sit here and play cards while that snake steals the kingdom." "Anger will not open doors, Alvin." A second voice joined the feed. Clara. She sounded calm, but Jim could hear the tremor underneath. "Dad taught us that," Clara said. "You blow the vents, they will just gas us. Think, Alvin." Jim smiled, a painful, fleeting thing. "Listen to your sister, Al. You are the captain now. Keep them safe." That is your only mission. But, Dad, Alvin's voice cracked. There is something else, Clara interrupted. Martha says the palace sounds wrong, Jim frowned. Wrong how? She says the heartbeat is skipping, Clara relayed. She says the walls are trying to scream, but something is holding their mouth shut. And she says the ozone smell it is coming from the core. Jim looked around his cell. The ozone. It wasn't just the smell of the force field. It was the smell of high-voltage ionization, the kind you got when a capacitor was being pushed past its limit. The siphon, Jim whispered. What? Clara asked. Nothing, Jim said. Listen to me. Tell Dr. Wren to scan the core's output, not the bio readings, the energy output. Tell her to look for a phantom load. Phantom load, Clara repeated. Got it. Dad, are you okay? Jim looked at the white walls, the oppressive light, the ghost of Miller standing in the corner of his vision. I am fine, Jim lied. Just bored. Go. Before the sweep catches you. The connection cut with a static pop. The bot Brio blinked its eye. Correction, the bot said in its own mechanical voice. Emotions are illegal in royal detention zones. Please refrain from experiencing familial bonding. It disturbs the sensors. Jim let out a dry, rattling laugh. Tell that to the Cubs, Brio. Tell that to the Cubs. 2 hours later, the force field shimmered and vanished. Jim stood up, ready for a fight. But it wasn't guards who entered. It was Keon Vale. The royal steward looked like he had been dragged through a hedge backward. His uniform was rumpled, his top button was undone, and he was sweating profusely. He carried a small food tray, his hands shaking so hard, the water glass was clicking against the plate. Dinner, Keon squeaked. He walked into the cell and set the tray down. Then he tapped a sequence on his datapad. The security camera in the corner of the ceiling looped a frozen image of an empty cell. I have 30 seconds, Keon hissed, leaning close to Jim. Dr. Wren found it. He slipped a tiny data chip into Jim's hand. It was warm. The phantom load, Keon whispered. You were right. The device beneath the nursery floor wasn't just jamming the Cubs. It was harvesting them. Jim gripped the chip. Harvesting. The resonance is energy, Keon explained rapidly. Pure bioquantum energy. Malk does not just want to control the Cubs. He is building a battery. If he forces the collars on them, he can drain their resonance directly into his own private grid. He will have the power of a star in his pocket, and the Cubs will be empty husks. Jim felt a cold fury settle in his gut, displacing the fear. Does Irene know? I cannot get to her, Keon said miserably. Malk has her isolated in the throne room. He is prepping the ceremony. The eclipse starts in 3 hours. He is going to force her to sign the order on live broadcast, just as the moon covers the sun. 3 hours, Jim repeated. I have to go, Keon said, stepping back. If they find me here, I am dead. Please, Jim, do not do anything stupid. Keon, Jim said. The steward stopped. You are a terrible spy, Jim said. But a good man. Keon managed a weak smile. I prefer a live steward, actually. He reactivated the force field and hurried away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Jim looked at the chip. He couldn't read it. He didn't have a terminal. But he didn't need to read it. He knew the mechanic. He had seen it on corrupt salvage yards a dozen times. You hook a bypass into the fuel line, skim a little off the top, and nobody notices until the engine stalls. Malk was stalling the entire empire. Jim sat back down. The ozone smell was stronger now. It was stinging his eyes. He closed his eyes, trying to think. He needed a plan. He needed a weapon. But all he had was a spoon, a glass of water, and a locked door. Inhale. Exhale. The panic began to rise again. The walls felt like they were closing in. He was back in the pod. The glass was cracking. The air was running out. "I can't save them," the voice in his head whispered. It sounded like Miller. "I couldn't save him. I can't save them." "Jim." The voice was not in his head. He opened his eyes. Irene was standing on the other side of the field. She was not wearing the royal robes. She was wearing a simple black flight suit, one that looked like it had been pulled from a museum display. Her hair was loose, falling around her shoulders in silver waves. She looked smaller without the crown, but more dangerous, like a blade without a scabbard. She tapped a code into the wall panel. The field dropped. She stepped inside. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was heavy with everything that hadn't been said in the Great Hall. "You look terrible," Irene said softly. "The accommodations are a 1-star at best," Jim replied, standing up. "I am thinking of leaving a bad review." Irene didn't smile. She walked over to him, stopping just inches away. She reached out and touched the bruise on his cheek, the one he had gotten when he tackled the plum cub. "I am sorry," she said. "Do not be," Jim said. "You did what you had to do. The move required a sacrifice. I was the pawn." "No," Irene said fiercely. "You are not a pawn. You are the only knight I have left on the board." She dropped her hand. "Malk has moved the timeline up," she said. "The signing is in 2 hours. He has the callers ready. He has the council lined up. He is going to strip me of the regency and chain the cubs right there on the dais." "He is siphoning the energy, Irene," Jim said. "Keon told me. It is a battery scheme." Irene's eyes widened. "A battery that explains why the palace is dying. The walls are gray. The biolights are fading. He is draining the citadel to charge his device." "We have to stop him," Jim said. "I cannot stop him," Irene cried, her voice cracking. "I have no guards. My personal detail has been replaced by his mercenaries. If I refuse to sign, he takes them anyway. If I fight, he kills us. I have run the simulations, Jim. There is no winning scenario." She turned away, wrapping her arms around herself. "I came to say goodbye," she whispered. "I am going to sign. I am going to save their lives, even if it destroys them. And then, I am going to abdicate. I will get you and your children off-world first. It is the only thing I can do." Jim looked at her back. He saw the defeat in the curve of her spine. She was a mother who had been told her children were terminally ill, and she was reaching for the only medicine available, even if it was poison. Jim reached into his pocket and pulled out the data chip Keon had given him. He tossed it in the air and caught it. "You know," Jim said conversationally, "when I was flying the outer rim, I had an engine blowout on a heavy freighter. Twin turbines carrying explosive gas. Both engines died. We were falling into a gravity well." Irene turned around, looking confused. "Jim, now is not the time for—" "Standard protocol said to eject," Jim continued. "Save the crew. Let the ship burn. But I had a problem. The ejection seats were offline." He stepped closer to her. "So I did the one thing the manual said never to do. I reversed the polarity on the magnetic brakes and turned the ship into a giant glider. We fell for 3 hours. We hit the ground so hard, my teeth rattled for a week. But we walked away." He held up the chip. "Malk is playing by the manual, Irene. He thinks you are going to eject. He thinks you are going to choose safety." "And what is the alternative?" Irene asked. "Crash the ship, no," Jim said. "We reverse the polarity." He grabbed her shoulders. "We do not stop the ceremony. We let him set it up. We let him bring the callers out. We let him turn on his siphon." "Are you insane?" Irene asked. "Probably," Jim admitted. "But listen. The eclipse creates a massive surge of resonance, right? The first rim of the eclipse hits in 2 hours." "Yes," Irene said. "The energy spike will be enormous." "Malk's siphon is designed to drain the cubs," Jim said. "It is a straw. But what happens if you pour a bucket of water into a straw all at once? Irene's eyes lit up as the physics clicked. It bursts. Exactly, Jim said. We do not fight the council. We do not fight the guards. We get the cubs to the apex. When the eclipse hits, we do not dampen them. We amplify them. We make them sing so loud so hard that they overload Malk's siphon and blow it right out of the floor. But the feedback, Irene said, her face paling. It could kill them. Not if they have an anchor, Jim said. Not if they have someone to hold the rhythm. You, Irene whispered. Me, Jim said. And you. And Alvin and Clara and Martha. We do not hide them, Irene. We bring the whole family. Irene stared at him. The fear was still there, but the despair was gone, replaced by the adrenaline of a desperate gamble. You are stuck in a cell, she pointed out. I cannot let you out. My codes have been revoked. The door is hard locked. Jim looked at the door mechanism. It was a complex weave of biometric scanners and magnetic bolts. I am a pilot, Jim grinned, though his hands were trembling slightly. I do not need a key. I just need a wrench and some bad attitude. I have to go back, Irene said, looking at the time. If Malk notices I am gone, he will lock down the nursery. Go, Jim said. Get the cubs ready. Tell them we are going to make some noise. Irene stepped back. She looked at him one last time. Jim, she said. Yeah. If we die, she said. I want you to know I would have liked to see what a second date looked like, Jim blinked. Wait, the hangar was a date. Irene smiled a real dazzling smile that lit up the gloomy cell. This is the date, Jim. You are in prison, and I am about to commit treason. It is very romantic. She turned and vanished into the shadows of the corridor. Jim stood alone in the cell. Okay, he said to the empty room. Romantic treason. I can work with that. He turned to the hydration dispenser on the wall. He ripped the metal faceplate off with a grunt of effort. Behind it lay the power couplings for the cell block. Alvin, Jim muttered, stripping the wires with his teeth. I hope you are listening, because Dad is about to open a door. The eclipse began, not with darkness, but with a color that didn't have a name. The sky above Astriel turned a bruised purple, and the sun began to be eaten by the first of the 9 moons. The light in the corridor shifted shadows, stretching and warping like taffy. Jim had his hands deep in the guts of the wall panel. He had bypassed the safety regulators. He had looped the power feed from the lighting system into the magnetic lock of the door. Come on, he gritted out, sweat dripping into his eyes. Do not fuse. Do not fuse. He needed a spark, a surge. He grabbed the 2 live wires. He took a breath. Inhale. Hold. He touched them together. Zap. A blue arc of electricity exploded in his face. It threw him backward, slamming him against the stone slab. His arm went numb. The smell of ozone was now replaced by the smell of singed hair. But the door hissed. The magnetic bolts groaned, confused by the voltage spike, and retracted. The energy field flickered and died. Jim scrambled up, ignoring the ringing in his ears. He kicked the door. It slid open halfway and stuck. He squeezed through the gap. He was out. He checked the corridor. Empty. Malk had pulled every guard to the throne room for the ceremony. Jim ran. He didn't run like a soldier. He ran like a father. He ran with a desperate loping stride, his boots skidding on the polished floors. He reached the service elevator. Locked. Forget it, Jim muttered. He pried the doors open with his bare hands and looked at the cables. He grabbed one and slid down the shaft, the friction burning his gloves. He dropped 3 levels and swung onto the nursery landing. The hallway was shaking. The palace was groaning a deep tectonic rumble that vibrated through the soles of his boots. The eclipse was touching the first rim. The resonance was building. Jim sprinted toward the nursery. The air here was thick, viscous. It felt like running underwater. The walls were pulsing violently, glowing with a sickly, feverish yellow light. The living architecture was in pain. He reached the nursery door. It was open. Inside, it was bedlam. The room was empty of people but full of noise. The furniture was floating. The holographic fish were screaming. But the cubs were gone. No, Jim breathed. He saw a scuff mark on the floor. A drag mark. They hadn't gone willingly. Dad, Jim spun around. Alvin, Clara, and Martha were huddled in the ventilation shaft opening near the ceiling. Alvin jumped down, followed by his sisters. "They took them," Alvin gasped, winded. 10 minutes ago. Malk's elite guard. They took them to the apex." "Where is Irene?" Jim asked. "She went with them," Clara said. "She looked scary, Dad. She looked like she was walking to a funeral." "The apex," Jim said, looking up. "The highest point. The direct line to the moons." The palace gave a violent lurch. A crack appeared in the wall next to them, leaking glowing blue fluid. "The structure is failing," Martha whispered, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "The palace is crying." Jim looked at his kids. They were terrified. They should be on a ship flying away from this. "Alvin," Jim said, "take your sisters. Get to the Iron Mule. Pre-flight check. Keep the engines hot." "No," Alvin said. He stepped forward. He looked exactly like Jim had 20 years ago. Stubborn, loyal. "We are not leaving." "Alvin." "You said we are a crew," Alvin cut him off. "You cannot fly this storm alone, Dad. You need a co-pilot." "I can hack the door locks at the apex," Clara added, pulling out her datapad. "Malk will have sealed it." "And I can hear them," Martha said softly. "I can tell you where the rhythm is broken." Jim looked at them. He wanted to scream at them to run, but he knew they wouldn't. They were his kids. They didn't run. "Okay," Jim said, his voice rough. "Okay, we go together." He grabbed a maintenance pry bar from the wall. "To the apex," Jim ordered. "Double time." They ran. Up the spiral ramps. Through the hall of statues where the stone kings of the past seemed to watch them with judgment. The vibration grew stronger. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was pressure. It pressed against their eardrums, their chests. Thump, thump, thump. It was the heartbeat of the eclipse. They reached the final door, the entrance to the apex observation deck. It was a massive slab of iridium sealed tight. "Clara!" Jim shouted over the roar of the building. Clara plugged her pad into the port. Her fingers flew. "Encryption is military grade. Give me 30 seconds." "We do not have 30 seconds," Alvin yelled, pointing out the window. The sky was black. The first moon had fully covered the sun. A ring of fire, the corona, was visible. And with it came the scream. It came from the other side of the door. It was the sound of 9 voices screaming in unison, not in anger, but in agony. The resonance was hitting them, and the siphon was sucking it out. "Dad!" Martha covered her ears, falling to her knees. "It hurts. They are fading." Jim looked at the door. He looked at the pry bar in his hand. He didn't think about the physics. He didn't think about the odds. "Alvin, grab the other side," Jim roared. They jammed the pry bar into the seam. "Pull!" They pulled. Veins popped in Jim's neck. The metal groaned. "Open, you son of a!" Jim grunted. Crack! The seal broke. The door slid open a foot. A blast of wind and noise hit them. It smelled of pure energy, of lightning and old stars. Jim squeezed through the gap. He stumbled onto the apex. It was a circular platform open to the sky. The wind was howling. In the center, 9 small cages of energy held the cubs. They were floating, their bodies arched, blue light streaming out of them into a black pylon, standing in the middle of the platform. Malk stood at a console, his hands raised in triumph. Irene was on her knees, held by 2 guards, screaming a name that the wind tore away. Jim took a step forward. The pressure was immense. It was like walking into a jet engine. One of the cubs, the plum one, opened its eyes. It saw Jim, and for a second, the screaming stopped. The cub let out a sound. A weak, desperate mewl. It was looking for the rhythm. Jim planted his feet. He took a breath. He ignored the guards. He ignored Malk. He ignored the collapsing sky. He opened his mouth. And he began to hum. The sky above the astral citadel did not simply darken. It shattered. As the ninth moon slid into place, completing the ninefold eclipse, the light from the sun was not blocked, but refracted. It split into a billion jagged shards of violet and bruising indigo, casting the apex observation deck in a light that looked like broken glass. The air itself seemed to solidify. The living walls of the palace, usually a silent, pulsing presence, began to emit a sound, a low, resonant vibration that sounded like a giant feline purring in pain. The smell of ozone was gone, replaced by something sharper, more metallic. It smelled like raw data burning. It smelled like the taste of a battery on the tongue. Chancellor Audrin Malk stood in the center of the chaos, his black robes whipping in the magnetic wind generated by the eclipse. He looked less like a bureaucrat and more like a conductor orchestrating a catastrophe. Behind him, the black pylon, the siphon was humming with a hungry, sucking noise, pulling visible streams of blue light from the 9 cages where the cubs floated. The council members huddled behind the blast shields on the lower tier of the deck looked terrified. They had come to see a ceremony. They were witnessing an execution. Malk raised a voice amplifier to his lips. "Behold!" Malk bellowed, his voice booming over the roar of the wind. "The resonance begins, and look at them. Look at the heirs. They are tearing themselves apart." He pointed at the cages. The cubs were writhing their backs, arched their mouths open in silent screams. The blue light of their fur was flickering, turning a sickly, feverish white. "The Queen is unable to stabilize them," Malk shouted, turning to point at Irene. Irene was on her knees near the edge of the platform, held back by 2 of Malk's elite mercenaries. Her hair was wild, her face pale. She wasn't fighting the guards anymore. She was staring at her children with a look of absolute, hollowed-out devastation. "She is weak," Malk continued, driving the knife in. "Her maternal instinct is a liability. She would let the citadel burn, rather than discipline these creatures. But I will not." He gestured to an aide who stepped forward, holding a silver case. The lid popped open, revealing 9 neural dampener collars. They gleamed with a cold, sterile light. "For the safety of the Empire," Malk declared, "I hereby invoke the Emergency Succession Act. I declare Queen Irene unfit. I assume guardianship of the heirs. The dampeners will be applied immediately." He reached for the first collar. "No!" Irene screamed, a raw, ragged sound that was swallowed by the wind. Malk ignored her. He walked toward the cage, holding the plum cub, the alpha. The creature was spinning helplessly, its eyes rolled back in its head. "Stop!" The word was not shouted. It was spoken with the flat, heavy intonation of a man who has decided that he is done running. Malk turned. The council turned. Irene looked up, her eyes widening. Jim stood at the breach of the blast door. His flight jacket was torn. His knuckles were bleeding and he was breathing hard. But he wasn't alone. To his left stood Alvin, holding a heavy wrench like a mace. To his right was Clara, her fingers flying across her datapad. And clinging to his leg was Martha. Her eyes squeezed shut, her small body acting as a lightning rod for the psychic pressure in the room. "You," Malk sneered. "The mechanic. You should be in a cell." "And you," Jim said, stepping onto the platform, "should read the manual. You are overloading the system." Jim didn't wait for permission. He walked forward. The pressure of the resonance was immense here, a physical weight that pressed against his chest, trying to stop his heart. It felt like walking into the exhaust of a thruster. "Get him," Malk ordered the guards. Two mercenaries moved to intercept. "Alvin Clara," Jim said calmly. "Blockade." Alvin didn't hesitate. He threw a smoke canister, something he had scavenged from the ship's emergency kit. It hissed, filling the space between Jim and the guards with thick gray fog. "Clara, the audio!" Jim barked. "Kill the bot!" Clara tapped her screen. On the far side of the deck, Brio, the nanny bot which had been hovering near the council, suddenly emitted a screeching feedback loop, a sound so piercing that the guards instinctively covered their ears, stumbling back. It bought Jim 10 seconds. He reached the center of the platform. He was 10 feet from the cages, 10 feet from Malk. The plum cub saw him. Through the pain, through the blinding light of the eclipse, the creature locked eyes with Jim. It reached out a paw, scratching at the energy field of the cage. Jim felt the connection hit him like a physical blow. It wasn't just empathy. It was a hook in his gut. "It is okay," Jim whispered, though the wind tore the words away. "I am here." He planted his feet wide. He closed his eyes. He blocked out the screaming wind, the shouting guards, the hum of the siphon. He found the rhythm in his own chest. Inhale. 2, 3, 4. He opened his mouth and let the sound out. It started low, a bass note that vibrated in the soles of his boots. But this time he didn't try to counter the storm. He didn't try to build a wall against the resonance. He leaned into it. He imagined he was back in the cockpit of the Iron Mule, flying through an ion storm. You do not fight the wind. You ride it. You find the thermal and you let it carry you. He matched his pitch to the scream of the palace. Then gently he bent the note. He took the chaotic, jagged frequency of the eclipse and he smoothed it out. He turned the scream into a song. The effect was instantaneous. The plum cub stopped writhing. Its ears swiveled forward. It let out a breath and the white fever light of its fur shifted. It turned a deep, rich indigo. Then the cub next to it synchronized. Then the next. One by one, the 9 heirs stopped fighting the energy flowing through them. They opened themselves to it. They let the resonance flow, guided by the anchor of Jim's voice. The chaotic noise in the air changed. It became a harmony, a chord, a massive celestial chord that rang out across the city, and Malk's siphon couldn't handle it. The black pylon began to whine. It was designed to suck up fear and chaos, jagged spiked energy. It wasn't built for harmony. The smooth, massive flow of the synchronized resonance hit the intake valves and overwhelmed them. "Warning!" A mechanical voice blared from the console. "Input exceeds capacity. Buffer overflow. Critical failure imminent." "No!" Malk screamed, slamming his fist onto the controls. "Dampen them. Cut the feed." "I cannot!" his aide yelled back. "The signal is locked. They are bypassing the limiter." Jim stepped closer, his voice rising in volume. He wasn't just humming now. He was vocalizing a melody, a simple haunting tune that rose and fell like a tide. Da-da-dum, da-da-dum. The blue light streaming from the cubs intensified. It turned into a blinding beam of pure energy. It didn't go into the siphon. It went through it. K-boom. The siphon exploded. Shards of black metal rained down on the platform. The feedback wave knocked Malk off his feet, sending him sliding across the deck. The cages flickered and died. The cubs were free, but they didn't run. They floated there, suspended in the eye of the eclipse, glowing like 9 miniature suns. They were calm. They were powerful. Jim dropped to one knee, exhausted. The song trailed off. Silence fell over the apex. The wind had died down. The eclipse was passing its peak, the ring of fire softening into a twilight glow. Dr. Sarah Wren and Steward Keon Vale burst through the service hatch, followed by a squad of royal guards who looked very confused. "Hold!" Keon shouted, holding up a data pad linked to the Citadel's main screen. "Do not fire. Look at the screens." Above the council, a massive hologram flickered to life. It was a recording. It showed the data stream from the siphon, the phantom load that Jim and Keon had uncovered. Chancellor Malk has been harvesting the bioenergy of the heirs for 6 months. Dr. Wren announced, her voice amplified for the entire deck to hear. The instability in the nursery was not natural. It was induced. He was torturing them to charge an illegal weapon battery. The council members gasped. The evidence was irrefutable lines of red code showing the energy transfer signed with Malk's own biometric key. Malk scrambled to his feet. His robes were singed, his hair wild. He looked around, seeing his political empire crumbling in real time. "Lies!" Malk shrieked. "They are monsters I was saving us. I was the only one with the will to control them." He looked at the cubs. They were floating above him, looking down with eyes that held no fear, only a terrifying ancient judgment. Desperation broke Malk's mind. He saw the plum cub, the alpha, drifting closest to him. "If I cannot control you," Malk hissed, pulling a disruptor pistol from his belt, "then I will break you." He raised the gun. "No." Irene scrambled up from the ground. She didn't have a weapon. She didn't have armor. She just had the terrifying speed of a mother. She launched herself at Malk, but she was too far away. Malk's finger tightened on the trigger. Jim was closer, but he was on his knees, winded. He couldn't reach Malk in time, so he used the only weapon he had left. He took a breath, and he didn't hum. He sang. He belted out a specific sequence of notes, sharp, commanding, resonant. It wasn't the soothing lullaby. It was an attack command. He didn't know what the words meant. He didn't know why he knew them. They just ripped out of his throat. The reaction was instantaneous. The 9 cubs didn't attack Malk. They became the attack. Their biofields merged. The indigo light turned a blinding, brilliant gold. A pulse of pure kinetic force slammed into Malk. It didn't burn him. It didn't cut him. It simply hit him like a freight train of solid air. Malk flew backward. He flew past the guards. He flew past the council. He flew right off the edge of the apex platform. His scream faded as he plummeted toward the safety nets far below. Silence returned. Absolute stunned silence. The cubs lowered themselves gently to the ground. The gold light faded back to a soft, happy blue. They trotted over to Jim, surrounding him, rubbing their heads against his knees, purring so loud it shook the deck plates. Jim sat there breathing hard, his hand resting on the head of the plum cub. Irene stood 10 feet away. She was staring at Jim. Her face was drained of all color. Her hands were trembling violently. "Jim," she whispered. Jim looked up. "It is over, Irene. He is gone." "That song," Irene said. Her voice was barely audible. "The one you hummed, and the command you just shouted." "I do not know where it came from," Jim said, rubbing his temple. "Just adrenaline, I guess. A lucky guess." "No." Irene stepped closer. She looked at the cubs who were curled around Jim as if he were the center of their universe. "That was not a guess. That was the lullaby of the Orion Nebula, and the second one that was the Vanguard command." She looked at him, searching his face, searching his eyes. "Only 2 people knew those melodies," Irene said, tears spilling over her lashes. "Me, and the man who wrote them." Jim frowned. "Irene, I told you. I am just a pilot. I picked up things during the war." "The war," Irene repeated. She walked right up to him. She reached out and touched his face, her fingers tracing the scar on his jawline. "You said you had a crash. You said you lost your memory of the year before the accident." "Yeah," Jim said. The headache was back, a splitting pain behind his eyes. 10 years ago, the crash in the nebula. I woke up in a medbay with a blank slate." "It was not a crash," Irene sobbed. "It was an ambush. We were there, together. A secret diplomatic mission that went wrong." She grabbed his hand and placed it on the plum cub's head. "Feel it, Jim," she pleaded. "Do not just touch the fur. Feel the resonance. Why do you think it matches you? Why do you think your voice calms them? Why do you think my children who hate everyone love you?" Jim looked down at the cub. He closed his eyes. He felt it. It wasn't just a biofield. It was a familiarity. It was the same feeling he got when he looked at Alvin, or Clara, or Martha. It was blood. The wall in his mind, the black wall that had hidden that lost year, began to crack. Flash. He was in a garden with purple flowers. A woman with silver hair was laughing. She was wearing a simple dress, not a royal robe. Flash. He was sitting on a balcony humming a tune to a woman who was holding her stomach. "If they are boys," he was saying, "we teach them to fly. If they are girls, we teach them to rule." Flash. The explosion. The fire. The woman screaming his name, not Jim, but James. "James, come back." Jim gasped, his eyes flying open. The air rushed into his lungs. "James," Irene whispered. Jim stared at her. The pilot. The scavenger. The single dad who thought he was just passing through. "Irene," he croaked. He looked down at the 9 cubs. They weren't just royal heirs. They weren't just aliens. They were his. They were the children of a marriage that never happened, born from a love that war had tried to erase. The biology of the cat alien species allowed for genetic resonance with a compatible partner, and he was the partner. "Oh, God," Jim whispered, covering his mouth. "I left you. I left you alone with them." "You did not leave," Irene cried, falling to her knees and wrapping her arms around him and the cubs. "You were lost. I thought you were dead. The report said no survivors. I have mourned you for 9 years." The council members were standing around, mouths agape. This was not the political drama they expected. This was a soap opera of galactic proportions. Alvin, Clara, and Martha stood by the blast door. Alvin lowered his wrench. He looked at the Queen hugging his dad. He looked at the 9 glowing space cats that were apparently his half-siblings. "So," Alvin sighed, looking at Clara. "We are officially a blended interstellar family." Clara rubbed her temples. "Please do not make me babysit royal kittens. I draw the line at litter boxes made of gold." Martha just smiled. She walked forward and joined the hug, burying her face in Jim's shoulder. "I told you," Martha whispered. "They were looking for you." 3 days later. The great hall was restored. The debris was cleared. The light of the astral sun filtered through the high windows, warm and golden. The council sat in their seats, but the atmosphere was different. Malk was gone, imprisoned in the very detention wing he had built. The evidence of his corruption had been broadcast to the entire system. Irene stood on the dais. She wore her crown, but her robes were lighter, less constricting. The 9 cubs sat around her, calm and majestic, their fur glowing with a healthy, steady light. Jim stood next to her. He wasn't wearing a uniform. He was wearing his flight jacket, cleaned and patched. He held Martha's hand. Alvin and Clara stood straight and proud beside him. "The 9-fold eclipse has passed," Irene addressed the council. "The resonance has stabilized. The heirs have proven their control." She looked at the council members, meeting each of their gazes. "For years we believed that power meant control," Irene said, her voice ringing clear. "We believed that to rule we had to suppress the wildness within us. We tried to put collars on the storm," she gestured to the cubs. "But true power is not suppression. It is harmony. It is the ability to listen to the different frequencies and find the song that connects them all." She took Jim's hand. A gasp went through the court, but nobody dared to object. "We almost destroyed the future of this empire because we were afraid of what we didn't understand," Irene continued. "We looked at difference and saw danger. We looked at emotion and saw weakness." She squeezed Jim's hand. "We were wrong. It was love that saved the Citadel. It was a father's instinct. It was a family's courage." She looked down at Alvin, Clara, and Martha. This is not just a royal family anymore, Irene declared. It is a family, messy, loud, complicated, and unbroken. She turned to Jim. Captain James, she said, a smile playing on her lips. Are the coordinates set? Jim smiled back. It was the smile of a man who had finally found his home port. Coordinates locked, Your Majesty, Jim said. But we are going to need a bigger ship. The Cubs let out a collective happy chirp. The council erupted into applause, tentative at first, then thunderous. Jim looked out at the crowd, then down at his kids, all 12 of them. The storm was over. The sky was clear. And for the first time in 100 years, the Palace of Astriel was singing a happy song. Epilogue. The Iron Mule was docked in the royal hangar, undergoing massive upgrades. Royal engineers were swarming over the hull, installing engines that cost more than a small planet. Jim sat on the cargo ramp, watching the sunset. The plum cub, now named Ace by Alvin, was asleep on his lap. Alvin walked up, wiping grease from his hands. The new hyperdrive is insane, Dad, Alvin said. We can make the Kessel run in under 12 parsecs. Not that we are smuggling anymore. We are not smuggling, Jim corrected. We are diplomatic couriers, with extensive luggage. Clara walked by, chased by 3 of the cubs, who were batting at her data pad. Dad, Clara yelled. Tell your furry children to stop hacking my firewall. They just ordered 3 tons of tuna to be delivered to the throne room. They are growing boys, Jim laughed. Let them eat. Martha sat next to Jim. She leaned her head on his shoulder. The palace is quiet now, Martha said softly. It likes the new song. Yeah, Jim said, kissing the top of her head. I like it too. Irene walked out of the elevator. She had ditched the crown entirely. She was wearing a flight suit that matched Jim's. Ready for the test flight, Captain? She asked. Jim stood up gently, shifting Ace to his shoulder. He looked at his wife, the one he had forgotten, and the one he had found again. He looked at his motley crew of humans and aliens. Born ready, Jim said. He grabbed his helmet. All right, everyone, Jim shouted. Strap in. Gravity is optional where we are going. As the ramp closed, the sound of laughter, human and alien alike, filled the cargo bay louder and brighter than any engine in the galaxy.